All right, welcome everyone. Good evening. As you can probably see, we're introducing ourselves in the chat, so if you have not already done that, go ahead and do so. My name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm the Resilience Program Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. And Creation Justice Ministries' mission is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christian communions, congregations, and individuals to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. We're so excited to be co-hosting this webinar with the Pew Charitable Trusts and with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality on the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, and specifically how faith communities can be involved in the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, also known as the CHIP. So if you hear the word CHIP, we're talking about this. We'll do our best to avoid acronyms. We have a really, really great program ahead of us today. Before we go through the agenda, I just want to go through a couple technical items. The first is we're going to ask you to please stay on mute for the first portion of the program. The first 2/3 will be presentations about the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. And so we ask during that time, you're welcome to post in the chat any questions or comments you have, but please do keep yourself on mute. The second thing, we will have a Q&A session after all of the presentations. So again, as questions arise throughout the presentations and during that Q&A session time, please enter your questions into the chat, or as you're invited, use your raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and we will call on you to ask your question. And finally, we will have a participatory feedback session as well. And during that time, you will be invited to offer verbal feedback as you are comfortable. But of course, you're not obligated to say anything or to turn your video on at any time, though you will be welcome to during that time. This session is being recorded and will be available afterwards. We'll be sure and send the recording in a follow-up email to everyone who's participating here today. And you are welcome to share that with anyone who is not able to join us today. And then in that follow-up email will also include all of the resources that are being shared today and some follow-up instructions for how you can continue to engage in the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan process. All right, so let's take a look at the agenda, where we're headed today. So we're going to start with an opening prayer and reflection from Tangi Middleton, who I will introduce in a moment. Then we'll hear from Jimmy Johnson with the Department of Environmental Quality, who will give us an overview of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. I'll share a little about churches and habitat protection, particularly why this is important to coastal churches in North Carolina. We'll hear about next steps and a little bit more about Pew Charitable Trusts from Lita Cunningham and Kelly Garvey. And then we will transition into our Q&A session and our discussion and feedback session. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Tangi Middleton. Tangi is the pastor of You Matter to God Church in New Bern. She's also community leader there. And she is a fellow student of mine and someone I've gotten to know pretty well over the last couple months. So Tangi, I will hand it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Avery, for the invitation to come and share. Before we get started, let's open up with a word of prayer. God, we just thank you and we praise you. We thank you for who you are in our lives. We thank you for being the creator of all humanity. We thank you, God, for how you have gathered us even at this time. God, we ask that you open up our ears and our hearts so that we can receive from you. Give us ways and ideas to care about your creation in a greater way. We give your name praise and we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, thank you again, everyone, for tuning in this evening. Thank you so much for the panel guests who have also joined in. I want to talk to you for just a few minutes. I promise I'm not going to preach tonight, so I'm just going to talk to you for a few minutes on God's call to creation. Psalms 24, verses 1 and 2 says this: "The earth is the Lord's and all of its fullness, the world and those that dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." I must say, I have read this scripture at least 1,000 times, but as of lately, it reads differently to me. It speaks to me in new ways. It makes me imagine this earth, this world, these people, and the seas, and wonder about our responsibility to God's earth. The very fact that God chose to create this earth and these people and the seas mean that they are important to God, and they should be important to us. So how we steward God's earth has a direct correlation on how we worship the God of creation. We have been afforded the opportunity to live here on the East Coast. If you like me, I really love living here in the city of New Bern. We are surrounded by beautiful skies, lovely beaches, calm seas most of the time, beautiful lakes, and a plethora of nice sights and nice greenery. But can I tell you that if we don't take an active part and invest our time, resources, and make others aware of our duty to care for creation, those same beautiful beaches and the same lovely seas and the same lovely greenery could vanish right before our very eyes. According to research, the coastal areas are very vulnerable right now and are being greatly impacted by human activity, pollution, and storms. As a matter of fact, climate change is affecting rising sea levels, and those sea levels could erode the coastal ecosystems, which would then interrupt the food chain and exacerbate land development. Now, think about it. With all of those things happening to our coast and all of these chain reactions, guess who suffers the most? You got it. The most vulnerable populations of people suffer the most. So those who are in poverty, those who already face food insecurities, the animals, the land, the earth, Black and brown people. You see, how we treat our neighbor is both a spiritual issue and a human issue. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates humankind and gives him dominion over all creation. We were God's crowning glory. We were created in God's image, and that gave us a special role of representing God in this earth. Now, this special role was meant for us to see God in all creation, and by reverencing God, we would care for creation. Creatures, land, vegetation, and the sea were to be managed by humanity so that there could be all sufficiency throughout the earth. So you see, this word dominion is not just about ruling over, but it comes with a greater responsibility and a relationship to the one who puts us in charge. The responsibility is not just given to people in high places and people in authority, but rather it is given to all people. It involves us embracing the idea that humans were created to live together and to depend on each other. From the beginning of time, God has given us all the privilege and a high moral obligation to not only care for creation, but to live in harmony with all of creation and ultimately become one with the Creator, who is God. So I ask you, in conclusion, God calls us to this communal sharing and caring for creation. So it's not just one person's responsibility, but it is all of our responsibility that's sitting here on this evening. And in doing so, when we care for creation, we honor God and we honor all of creation. Besides, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and the fullness thereof, in the world and all they that dwell therein. So I challenge you on today to get involved wherever you are. Become a part of the solution. Make what's important to God important to us. So when there's an opportunity to care for creation and to be one with our neighbor, let's jump on board, because the earth is the Lord's and He's given us the responsibility to be in relationship with all of humanity and all of creation. Thank you and God bless you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Tangi. Next up, we will have Jimmy Johnson from the Department of Environmental Quality.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Tangi, thank you for those words. I appreciate very much the sentiment behind them. And I think it's most appropriate that what you said at the very beginning about being stewards of God's creation, how we do that, how we steward God's creation, I think says an awful lot about what we think about God Himself. And so it's incredibly important for us to be good stewards of what's been entrusted into our care. My name is Jimmy Johnson, and I am the Coastal Habitats Coordinator. I work within the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, which is housed and based in the Department of Environmental Quality. I also have the privilege of being a bivocational pastor of a small Southern Baptist congregation in Swan Quarter down in Hyde County, for those of you that are familiar with Eastern North Carolina. And my job tonight is to give you an introduction to North Carolina's Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. And Avery, I'm not able to get it to advance my PowerPoint.
Yeah, you might try just exiting out and resharing. We'll see how that works for us.
Stop share. Try this again. Oh my, so much for practicing beforehand.
There might be an arrow in the bottom left corner. Is it coming up for you?
No, it's not.
Well, I think I have your slides actually. Let me pull those up.
Well, I've changed it since.
That's right. Okay.
And I apologize for this. Does that show up? Or are you still seeing me?
I still see you, yeah.
It's not good. Share screen. How's that?
Yep, we see it.
You had it, but you let it go.
Ah,
There we go.
there we go.
Right.
All right. I apologize for that. I have no idea what happened or what I did to get to this point. But anyway, my job description this evening is to provide you with just a quick overview of what the North Carolina Coastal Habitat Protection Plan really is. And so we will get started. The late Dr. Pete Peterson, he used to call the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan the voice for the fish. And I believe it has also become the voice for stewardship and the importance of protecting our coastal habitats, not just for fish, but also for communities and for the heritage that is found in each of those communities. The Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, or the CHIP, it originated out of concerns for the fisheries of North Carolina and the recognition that we can't improve fish stocks if we don't address the issue of habitat and water quality as well. For those of you that have been in Eastern North Carolina for several decades, you'll remember that back in the 90s, North Carolina was experiencing declining fish stocks. We were having fish kills. There were all kinds of closures for shellfish harvest. Algal blooms were popping up all over everywhere. And then the coastal development craze, where everybody wanted to move to the coast, was also taking place. And the legislature recognized the need for some additional habitat protection and also restoration. And so when the Fisheries Reform Act of 1997 was passed, part of that legislation included the writing of a coastal habitat protection plan, or even possibly a number of different coastal habitat protection plans. Ultimately, it was decided to go with one large plan for the entire coast. And part of, as I mentioned, that legislation required the CHIP to be developed by the Department of Environmental Quality. And it required the 3 regulatory commissions that have regulatory authority in the coastal parts of North Carolina, the Environmental Management Commission, Coastal Resources Commission, and the Marine Fisheries Commission. It required them to work together and to implement the recommendations that are found in the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. And the approach of the legislation was primarily to improve communication among the commission, among the divisions within the department, and enhance the department's ability to protect, restore, and enhance the water quality in North Carolina. The first plan was completed in late 2004, and the implementation began in 2005. And the legislation requires that the plan be reviewed and, if necessary, updated every 5 years. The CHIP is it's a resource. It's a guide for agencies, for academia, and for NGOs, and it summarizes the latest science on the coastal habitat conditions and threats. DEQ agencies with CHIP responsibilities include APNEP, who I work for, the Division of Coastal Management, the Division of Marine Fisheries, the Division of Water Resources, the Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources, as well as forestry and soil and water in the Department of Agriculture. And the governance of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan and its implementation is through what we call a CHIP steering committee. And that committee is made up of 2 commissioners from each of the 3 regulatory commissions that I just mentioned. And they serve as liaisons between the agency staff and their full commissions. And their role is to share information regarding what is going on with the implementation of the CHIP, to explain the actions and any other issues that may come up, and to help get the full commission sort of up to speed with what is taking place regarding implementation of the CHIP. They provide the initial review and the approval of the plan before we take it to the 3 full commissions. The legislation required that the plan contain important habitats, specifically with regards to fisheries and fish production, the threats to those habitats, priority issues concerning those habitats, and recommendations of what can be done to protect, restore, and enhance the specific habitats that are mentioned in the CHIP. Over the past 2 iterations, this one that we're working on now and the one in 2016, we decided to take a little bit more of a focused approach. And so we chose a few priority issues that we wanted to focus on in order to see how much progress could be made regarding those specific issues. The source document, if you ever see a physical copy of it, is very large. It's about 600 pages, and it's full of all kinds of research information, and it is probably the envy of most of the states on the East Coast, because when I go to meetings, all the states talk about how much they wish they had a document like the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. The CHIP is organized around 4 goals, and the recommendations are under each of those 4 goals. For example, the recommendations under goal number 1 include outreach, like we're doing here tonight, and also increased compliance with the rules that are already in place. Recommendations for goal number 2 include to complete and maintain mapping of shell bottom and wetlands of seagrasses, and also to assess their conditions and the value that they have to fisheries production. And then also to evaluate and prioritize areas for enhanced protection for just a little bit more, to help to keep them in the shape that they currently are in. Recommendations for the 3rd goal include encourage living shorelines over hardened seawalls and structures, or vertical stabilization. Also to expand habitat restoration, specifically with oyster reefs and riparian wetlands. And then the recommendations for the 4th goal include reducing runoff through improved coastal stormwater rules. The Coastal Habitat Protection Plan has identified 6 specific habitat types that are of primary importance to fish production. And they include the water column, soft bottom wetlands, submerged aquatic vegetation, shell bottom, and the ocean hard bottom. In North Carolina, there are about 2.2 million acres of coastal waters. And unfortunately, there's approximately 450,000 acres of those open waters that are now currently closed to shellfish harvest because of water contamination, either through stormwater runoff or from some other means. North Carolina has about 4.5 million acres of wetlands, and it has been estimated that there has been approximately a 58% loss of those wetlands since the 1800s. Submerged aquatic vegetation, We also call it SAV for short. We're not exactly sure how much there used to be in North Carolina, but there's currently about 191,000 acres of SAV. And unfortunately, the trend is going down for this incredibly important habitat for fish production. North Carolina also has about 20,000 acres of shell bottom. And it's almost hard to believe, but that's about a 90% decrease in the subtidal oysters within the Pamlico Sound. Those oyster beds that were here 2 centuries ago, 90% of those that are found in the Pamlico Sound now are gone. The chip includes information on the different types of threats or human influences that impact habitat and water quality. And as you can see, there's a lot of different threats that are associated with loss of habitat, and there's really not one specific problem that is responsible for coastal for the degradation of our coastal ecosystem, but it's more of a sense of death by 1,000 cuts. We've seen hydrologic alteration, physical alterations on the land, water pollution, fishing practices that are not compatible with some of our habitats, and all of these affect the water quality and they affect our coastal habitats, and you can see the impacts that they have in our coastal area, and all of these lead to a decline in our fish stocks and in our fisheries. I mentioned that the last 2 iterations of the plan have decided to focus on some very specific issues. This plan amendment that we're currently working on for the end of this year, we've decided to look at these 5 priority habitat issues. The submerged aquatic vegetation, the protection and restoration of it with a focus on water quality improvements. We want to focus on water quality because that is the primary cause of the loss of SAV. There's a lot of good work that is already being done to address the physical impacts to SAV. There have been a lot of changes to the regulations regarding bottom disturbing fishing gear, and also with regards to water dependent development. And we sort of look at SAV like the canary in a coal mine when it comes to water quality. Environmental rule compliance to protect habitat and water quality is another priority issue. And it's been proven that with added enforcement, we see it has a very positive trend with regards to compliance, because if you are concerned about getting caught doing something wrong, you probably are not going to do something wrong. And so that's one of our priority habitat issues this time as well. Reducing inflow and infiltration, I&I, is associated with wastewater infrastructure to improve coastal water quality. And inflow and infiltration was actually raised as a significant issue from one of our division directors and the issues that they were seeing with the work that they were doing. It's widespread, it's prevalent in eastern North Carolina, with some of the poorer rural communities that just don't have the tax base to be able to go in and fix and repair their infrastructure. It's costly, and unfortunately, it tends to be an environmental justice issue, because so many of the towns and communities that are affected by this, they don't have the tax base to be able to repair what's going on, and oftentimes we see those communities to be communities of color. Wetland protection and enhancement with a focus on nature-based methods. We're continually losing important wetlands, And these wetlands, they provide filtration and they provide protection. They help to knock down high energy waves, and they're critically important with regards to being able to maintain shorelines. Living shorelines was a priority issue in our 2016 CHIP, and we felt it was important enough to continue looking at that issue in this next iteration. We also want to begin to plan for future migration inland and upland of these wetlands. And then the fifth priority issue is habitat monitoring to assess status and regulatory effectiveness. And we need to know from where we've come. We need to know how much more we need to do, and we also need to know if what we're doing now is working. And so that's become a focus of this next CHIP amendment. So why should you care about coastal habitat protection? Well, in my mind, if you like to fish or if you like to eat fish, then you should care. Roughly 90% of important North Carolina fisheries spend some time of their life within the estuaries of North Carolina. Many communities have been built around the fishing industry, and so it's culturally and as far as heritage goes, it's very significant to many places in eastern North Carolina. Plus, it's a very large generation of income and economic viability for eastern North Carolina. Even if you don't like to fish or to eat seafood, these habitats they're working for you. They're doing important work to help keep you safe, to help with regards to storm damages, to keep those as low as possible. We call this ecosystem services, and it's a term that's used to describe benefits to human beings provided by nature and these ecosystems. Wetlands is featured on this slide here. It's the first line of defense for trapping nutrients and pollutants from upland runoff. Cleaner water benefits not only fish, but all the other submerged habitats, as well as the human uses for the water, swimming, shellfish harvest. And multiple studies have shown that wetlands that are in good shape significantly reduce the nutrients that could make it into the waters. And that's why these buffers along our shorelines are so incredibly important. They also serve as a means of erosion control. Shoreline erosion rates of 50% less were shown when the shoreline was vegetated versus non-vegetated shoreline. And even narrow borders of these wetlands, of these marshes, help to reduce wave energy by anywhere from 50 to 80%. You can see that economists have put a value on these ecosystem services as somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.3 million per square kilometer per year. They also serve as floodwater storage. It's almost impossible to believe, but wetlands are like living sponges, and they can store up to 300,000 gallons per acre per day. They also help to recharge our aquifers, which many of our eastern North Carolina communities and towns depend on for their drinking water. The oyster reefs, the oysters provide all of the same ecosystem services that the wetlands do, with the exception of a significant amount of carbon sequestration. Due to their hard, complex structure, they are excellent at protecting shorelines from erosion. Plus, oysters can filter, it's been estimated, they can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. And not only are oyster reefs a habitat, but they're also a fishery as well. Submerged aquatic vegetation provides extensive ecosystem services as well. carbon sequestration. 10% of the total organic carbon sequestered in the ocean is buried in seagrass beds. And since these habitats provide similar ecosystem services, these three that I've just mentioned, you may be asking yourself, why do we need to worry about all of them? Well, they all do a lot of the same thing, but they do different things very well. They benefit one service or another better than the other. That's why we find it important to focus not just on one very specific habitat, but on a broad array of the different habitats. They do a lot. They do a lot well, but some do. Some provide those ecosystem services better than the other. Scientists are concerned that these habitats and the benefits they provide are an increased risk to climate change. And the expected changes include increasing storm intensity, increasing sea level rise, changing water temperature and salinity. And this could all result in losses to our wetlands. It could result in shoreline erosion, degraded water quality leading to loss of oyster habitat, as well as SAV. And these changes will all increase coastal community vulnerability as well. I want to take just a moment to look at this small community in Hyde County, North Carolina. It's on St. Lydia Road. They call it St. Lydia. And this is, it's a community that at one time was made up of people of color. There were only about 10 to 12 houses in that community, along with the St. Lydia Baptist Church. Most of the homes that are found there have been abandoned due to flooding and high water levels that are coming from Lake Mattamuskeet. And you may wonder why we're concerned about Lake Mattamuskeet. Well, the lake is supposed to drain into water bodies in eastern North Carolina. It's supposed to drain into the Pamlico Sound and the Alligator River. And because of sea level rise, because of environmental conditions, the tide gates that are used to help control Lake Mattamuskeet are not functioning as they were intended to, because the pressure on the sound side of those tide gates is higher than it is on the lake side. And so the water can't go out the way it's supposed to. So it goes out across the land and into these small communities. And these results are, a displaced community. And also it presents a water quality issue because all of these smaller communities are on septic systems. And, would proper planning have kept this from happening? I really don't know, because St. Lydia's been around for a long time, and I don't think 100, 125 years ago, anybody ever would have even imagined this happening. But still, community planning is significantly important to these small communities in these less popular counties that border along eastern North Carolina. Habitat management actions can reduce climate change impacts. There are actions that can be taken to increase coastal community resilience. Coastal habitat protection and restoration can be a nature-based solution to climate change and the issues that climate change is causing us to face. And all of the priority issues that we are addressing, the 5 in this CHIP amendment, all address resilience to some degree or another. So how can you get involved in the CHIP process? Well, there are several ways. You can look at the draft issue papers, which are on the Division of Marine Fisheries website. You can provide comments. The CHIP Steering Committee will meet on April the 20th. It's a virtual meeting, but there's always a time for public comment in those meetings. You can attend a commission meeting or write a letter to one of the different commissions explaining your support for the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. And then once the plan is out in August or September of this year, feel free to plan to come and participate in one of the public sessions where we will receive public comment. And then also be sure to share your support for implementing the plan actions with your local community and government leaders. Here's a timeline of where we are and where we need to be by the end of the year. And you can see that we're completing our draft sections. The final 2 issue papers will be presented at the April 20th steering committee. And from then we will have some public meetings with public comment later on in the year. And hopefully the plan is to have the amendment adopted in November of this year. And I'll conclude with this. It would be wonderful to get back to being able to have this type of success when you go fishing, whether it's with nets or with hook and line. But in order for us to have healthy, resilient communities, we need to be sure that we are protecting the habitats as well as the fisheries that utilize those habitats. And I personally believe it can be done, but we have to be willing to do the hard things. And we have to be willing to do the work and make the sacrifices necessary for this to take place. And here's my contact information. There's also a link to the 2020 CHIP documents. 2021, we have lingered into 2021, but all of the information that you need is right there on that link. And that's it for me, Avery.
Great. Thank you so much, Jimmy. So much.
Hopefully it didn't take too long.
No, that was quite all right. All right. So Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind, could you drop that link that you just shared into the chat so that people can have access to that? I'll take your silence as a yes.
Yes, I will try and figure out how to do that.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'll just be building on what Jimmy was sharing with us and thinking through with y'all about how, in particular, the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan relates to our religious communities. So again, my name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm the Resilience Program Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. Here's my email. I'll share it again at the end. And I'll be talking specifically about land and climate change and climate resilience. And in particular, why does coastal protection matter for our churches? Jimmy gave us a really great introduction as to why it matters for our communities, for our ecosystems, for creation. But specifically, how does coastal environmental change have an impact on our faith communities? And how can the CHIP be a tool for helping our communities care better for our people and for our land? To this end, I will be using 3 scriptures to help us explore why coastal habitat protection is a matter of faith. So we're going to start with this scripture from the book of Nehemiah from the Hebrew Bible. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we may no longer suffer disgrace." Then they said, "Let us start building." So they committed themselves to the common good. Now, what I don't want you to do is take this and think that this is advocating for building a seawall, because I think what we've learned from Jimmy is that wetlands and oyster reefs are much more effective than seawalls will be. But what I think the story of Nehemiah shows us, and for a background for those who aren't familiar, Nehemiah came around a couple centuries after Jerusalem had been burned to the ground and the walls had fallen down and the temple had been destroyed. And he came into this and had a vision for the renewal of his community. And standing among the rubble, he saw how he could stand shoulder to shoulder with his neighbors, and together they could commit themselves to the common good of rebuilding something that had been broken down. So what I see here is resonance with thinking about climate change and the effects of hurricanes and the effects of sea level rise. And, seeing the rubble in some instances that we literally find ourselves in, the rubble that sometimes we spiritually find ourselves in when we think about the devastation to God's creation, and how we can partner together and rebuild not only physically, but prepare ourselves and our communities for the effects of climate change. In other words, Nehemiah can be read as a story of climate resilience. And to commit ourselves to the common good, perhaps we need to consider how climate change will impact the communities we love and care for. And this relates to the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, because as Jimmy mentioned in his presentation, healthy habitats mean greater resilience to climate change. So what I want to show us is how climate change might actually affect our coastal church communities. This is some of the work we've been doing at Creation Justice Ministries at the Resilience Program. These maps are available at creationjustice.org. And what we're looking at here is, I hope you can recognize, the Southeast coast, the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula, very, very obviously protruding there. And every orange dot that you see on this map is a church. Now, this is not every single church in North and South Carolina, but this is a representative sample. Nationwide, there are about 70,000 churches in this map. So it's a good number being represented here. And this is the current sea level. The current high tide sea level, I should say. The mean high or high water, for those of you who appreciate the technical language. All of the dark blue is the current sea level. And so what I'm going to show you for the next couple slides is how our coast could change with higher levels of sea level rise. So I'll show you a slide that shows 3 feet of sea level rise, which is a possibility within the next 75 years, and then 6 feet of sea level rise, which is a possibility within the next century. And of course, these possibilities are dependent upon our ability to take mitigation actions on climate change. So at 3 feet of sea level rise, the light blue is the projection from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for what the coastline might look like. This is where there would be water at high tide with 3 feet of sea level rise. The 6 feet of sea level rise, this is what we would be looking at. So you can see there's quite a bit of water there along the coast of North Carolina, the Outer Banks, of course, but also the coastal plain, and impacting a number of churches all along the coast. And what I want to say here is that this map that I'm showing you is helpful to see what might happen, what could very well happen, but it alone doesn't solve any problems. We can look at this map all day and we cannot make any changes. But what it does is it begs an important question for our faith communities. How can we prepare for these changes? How, as churches that serve many different missions in our communities, how can we act as shepherds in our communities as both the physical and the spiritual impacts of climate change make themselves felt? So here's one way how this tool can help. The first is by identifying specific faith communities along the coast. Y'all might be familiar with Faith Baptist Church, which is in Columbia. As you can see, Faith Baptist Church, would be very impacted by 3 feet of sea level rise. So how can this community serve as an ark, perhaps, to help those whose homes and livelihoods will be underwater? How can it be involved in the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan to, protect wetlands and oyster reefs and restore those places that need to be restored so that it has better resilience to sea level rise and to the storms that are impacting it? Another community to look at would be Macedonia African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And this is one that I want to point out because it's likely that this church will not be underwater, as you can see here. But a related question comes up, which is, it will be in the middle of a flooded community. And so how can Macedonia AME Zion practice climate hospitality and solidarity? What choices can it make now so that when severe flooding does happen, it's ready to help its community? And this is a question we can pose to our own faith communities, I would guess most of which fall into this latter category of not being directly affected. How can we be in solidarity with our neighbors and communities who are being directly affected by climate change? As we heard both from Tanji and from Jimmy, those communities that are the most vulnerable ones, communities of color, low-income communities along the coast who are feeling most heavily the impacts of hurricanes and the impacts of sea level rise. And I want to say that these questions will define the witness of our faith over the next century. That faith leaders think a lot about how to stay relevant. And I just want to say that the answer is to prepare for the environmental crisis, for environmental degradation, by building resilience in your community, by preparing for the changes that are going to happen, and by engaging with the Department of Environmental Quality, with the other North Carolina resilience work, policy work, to ensure that God's coastal creation, God's marine creation, with these ecosystems that God blessed us with, that help us mitigate and adapt to these changes, that we can advocate for the ways in which those can be restored and regenerated and protected. Again, this map is available at creationjustice.org/resilience. And I'll be sure to drop that link in the chat at the end. And what I want to say is these questions that I'm bringing up about how the church can be involved, how the church can prepare, how the church can build resilience, this is already core to the mission of our churches. So here are a couple of pictures here of what our communities are already doing. We're already housing our underhoused neighbors. We're already hosting food pantries for those who can't afford food and don't have access to food. We're organizing volunteers to respond to disasters in our communities. We're already doing this amazing work. And so what I'm offering here is an invitation to extend this wonderful work that you're doing in a way that prepares for the kind of changes that we might experience over the next century. And the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan can be an extension of this mission-based work. Because by protecting habitat, again, we're becoming more resilient to climate change. We're protecting our communities, and we're protecting God's creation. And that's the second scriptural passage that I want to share here. The parable of the mustard seed from Matthew's gospel. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. What Jesus is saying here is that our acts of faith, however small they are, have consequences for the people and the creatures around us. That the seeds we plant now, both those literal seeds and those metaphorical seeds, through the treatment of our lands, through the cleaning of our waters, through how we talk about creation in our churches, they grow into mustard trees that house the birds of the air, that have downstream effects of creating habitat for these non-human creatures that are a part of our community. So what I'm inviting us here to is the question of how can we change how we treat our land to care for our neighbors and build resilience? And a couple examples here of how coastal churches in other parts of the country are doing this. In Annapolis, Maryland, there's a church called St. Luke's Eastport that rehabilitated a wetland on their own property to provide climate resilience and habitat. Eastminster Presbyterian in Indialantic, Florida has been involved in planting mangroves along their local shoreline. So just as we advocate for protection of wetlands and oyster reefs and God's coastal creation with the Department of Environmental Quality, so too are we reflecting this in our own communities. And I think that's really important because we want to live out the change that we want to see in this world, that it's important that we are doing the work in our communities as well as shepherding our communities and advocating for the work in a public space. So I stole these pictures from Jimmy's slides just to remind you of all the creatures who are affected by the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. Again, all kinds of waterfowl and turtles and tortoises, and of course, our own communities. And protecting our animal and plant creatures is an extension of our love for God. And I love how Jimmy put it earlier that the way we care or don't care for creation and for creatures tells us a lot about how we care or don't care for God. I want to end with this verse from the Genesis 2 creation story. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. Now, in this story, which is the older of the two creation stories, in this story, God creates Adam by kneeling down and picking up the dust of the ground and breathing the breath of life into him, and to create this soil creature, really, created from the soil and the breath of God. And God's first command to Adam is to till and to keep the Garden of Eden. Now, for the agrarian society in which this was written, these people were farmers. And so to till and to keep the ground, those are words of care. That means to serve and preserve. Yes, to use, to fish, to farm, but to do so with care, because this is God's good creation. Now, I know that for many of us, North Carolina, the coast, it's our Garden of Eden. It's paradise. We feel God's love so closely in these spaces. If we feel God's love here, we ought to reflect that love back out and work to protect these habitats and these creatures. Because caring for habitat is caring for God's creatures, and caring for God's creatures is loving God. Again, here is my email address. And if you want to learn more about the resilience program at Creation Justice Ministries, you can find that at creationjustice.org/resilience. And thanks, Eliza, for dropping that in the chat. With that, I will pass it along to Kelly and Lita.
Hi, good evening. This is Lita. I think I'm going to kick it off. I'm not sure who has our, oh, never mind. Ask and you shall receive. So yeah, my name's Lita. I manage Pew's coastal habitat protection and restoration work in the state of North Carolina. I'm not sure how familiar you are with our organization, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. The Pew Charitable Trust is based in Washington. We've been around since the 1940s, largely as a foundation. And then in early 2000s, we became a public charity. So we now actually have over 1,000 staff working around the world on issues from, as a colleague says, from beluga whales to banking to ballet. So issues that include the environment, also prison reform and credit card and consumer issues and economics, and we do a lot of polling. So if you listen to the National Public Radio, you may have heard of Pew. So we're all sort of that family. We work around the world. Some of our domestic marine conservation work is almost entirely focused on coastal habitat protection. And we've been doing that here in North Carolina for only a couple of years. And so our role here is to really elevate and enhance some of the great work that's already been happening with DEQ and with the Albemarle Pamlico group that Jimmy is a part of, and many NGOs and some of our newer partners like Creation Justice Ministries. So this is an opportunity for us to really help protect places in North Carolina and through education and outreach. Like I said, we're trying to elevate a lot of the great work that's happening here and assisting partners because North Carolina is so special. I mean, we've really looked across the country, and North Carolina stood out as just a place of incredible ecosystems, and besides nature, the communities and the resilience in the people here. So we're kind of the new kids on the block, but we're really excited to be working with y'all and with Avery and Eliza and Jimmy and many of the others. So I hope that you will take some of the actions that Jimmy mentioned. I hope you'll become more involved and more engaged, and especially that you'll weigh in during public comment later this year. The CHIP is sort of the greatest management document no one's ever heard of, but it's really a remarkable process. So thanks for being part of it, and yeah, hope to connect with you in your community sometime.
Thanks, Lita. I'm just going to do a super quick introduction. My name is Kelly Garvey, and thank you all. This was such great presentations. I just quickly want to talk about the ways to get involved. I've been working with Lita at Pew and the North Carolina Coastal Federation for almost a year now on building the North Carolina Coastal Habitat Coalition. Our goal is to support the CHIP and help get it through the commissions and implement these, great nature-based solutions to resilience and fisheries and ecosystems. So there are a few ways. Jimmy shared a really detailed timeline, but I just want to let you all know that, so we at the North Carolina Coastal Habitat Coalition will be sending out emails and letting folks know about when to advocate, and so I know there was a question about that in the chat. So there are a number of ways to follow with us, and you all can reach out to us directly too if you are interested in sharing this support with your community networks through things like letters to the editor, hosting webinars, or if you come up with other creative ideas or things that you think people need to know this and you've got ideas, definitely reach out, because we're here to help get the word out. So these are all the contact infos. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can email me at right here, and then on our website at www.nccoastalcoalition.org, you can sign up to be on the listserv. And I'd say that's one of the, a great way to just get involved with the coalition. We've still got quite a few months here, but get on the listserv now. We'll be sure to let you know when to engage. So I am going to stop sharing now. Thanks all.
All right, thanks so much, Kelly and Lita. So at this point, we're going to transition into our question and answer period. We have a couple queued up in the chat, but if you have any questions, please post those in the chat, and I will pose them to our panelists for about the next 5 or 10 minutes. So the first one I want to start with is from Susanna Tuttle. Susanna asks, is there any advocacy we can do as faith communities to support any funding that DEQ needs for this incredible work?
Yeah, and in response to that, I would think that anything that you could do with your local legislators, or within the General Assembly would be very helpful. The department has taken tremendous cuts over the past 7 or 8 years. We've lost almost probably a third or more of our funding. Most of that would be in compliance positions. And, I spoke to that earlier, that greater compliance officers in the field mean increased compliance by the people that are working in the habitats, and so it's incredibly important there.
Great, thanks, Jimmy. Lita or Kelly, anything you want to add on?
Yeah, I would just say to follow us, like I just said, but in particular, I think as we get closer, we'll try and get a lot of advocacy at time it well, so and let you all know exactly when it's coming up, and try and mobilize folks at the same time, because that can be it's always, timing is always good to be thinking about. So
I would add, just in informal conversations in your community, to just talk up DEQ. I think it would be easy to be a state manager and sort of go, it's probably a pretty thankless job. And so to the extent that you can sort of help them out and give them a public pat on the back if you find yourself in community meetings where there are questions that come up, or if no one's ever heard of them, these are the hardworking people who've spent their careers doing plans just like this so that we can all enjoy the benefits and have something in the future. So I think, there's advocacy, like Jimmy said, about, financial, but there's also just talking them up in your community as great people doing important work that a lot of people don't ever see.
Great. A question from Heather Barlow. Watersheds cross state lines. Are there any interstate programs, either through DEQ or otherwise, that are getting at some of these same goals as the CHIP?
Our program, the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, does cross over state lines, and we are active in Virginia. That is all part of the watershed, and so it's included in our geographic region. So we have a partnership with the state of Virginia. There has been recently a lot of work between our DEQ and our counterparts up in Virginia, along with the Departments of Agriculture and Wildlife Resources, to put into place an MOU or an MOA with regards to working together across state lines. At one point, there was a Chowan watershed roundtable that was housed in Virginia, and we were actively a part of that. So there are some cross-state initiatives that are taking place, but we could certainly do more.
I'll say from Creation Justice Ministries perspective, we are a national organization, so we are committed to working on coastal protection wherever there's a coast. So Heather, if there are folks in other states who are interested in engaging in this work from a faith-based perspective, please do point them in the direction of CJM.
Avery, Stacy Fakin, who I work with, has she dropped a link into the chat with regards to the MOU.
Great.
Thanks, Stacy.
Okay, we'll do one more question before we move on to our feedback and discussion. And this is from Carl. Have the economic costs to fisheries from extreme weather like recent hurricanes been measured? Do you know of any studies?
I'm not aware of anything specific, but I'm sure that the Department of Commerce has some information with regards to the cost of the hurricanes. And not just the hurricanes, some of the winter northeasters have been just as bad as the summer hurricanes. But yeah, there's been some work done on like the cost to oyster beds and oyster leases, how much was lost during some of the storms. I think the Department of Agriculture, NCDA, has done some work there. But I feel fairly certain that the Department of Commerce would have some figures.